The fluorescent lights hummed above aisle 7 like a swarm of mechanical locusts, and Elena Martinez rotated the expired medications with the methodical precision of someone who'd once triaged casualties under incoming fire. 3 bottles of metformin. 2 tubes of hydrocortisone cream. 1 container of sertraline with an expiration date that had passed 147 days ago, she'd counted. The pharmacy section of SaveMart in Raleigh was her vantage point, her cover, and her hunting ground. Naval Intelligence didn't send Captain Elena Martinez into grocery stores to restock shelves. They sent her to watch. To document. To catch the kind of fraud that left Medicare bleeding $847,000 every fiscal quarter through inflated pharmaceutical orders that never quite made it to patients who needed them. She knew exactly who was stealing. She just needed the paper trail to prove it. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd spent 12 years in operating theaters that exploded, and she knew that her movements were wrong for this place. Too efficient. Too controlled. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The faded 2nd Medical Battalion unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one she touched at 3 a.m. when the nightmares came, was the only testament to what she'd been before the vest, before the name tag that read Elena M. Pharmacy, before she'd become invisible. She wore long sleeves even in summer. Not for modesty. For the jagged scar that ran along her left forearm like a roadmap of Helmand Province, a souvenir from the insurgent who'd lunged at her during the evacuation of FOB Shank. The scar caught the light sometimes, and when it did, she wore the sleeves. The morning staff meeting started at 7:15 a.m., and Elena arrived exactly on time. Derek Pierce ran SaveMart like a man who'd never had real power and was determined to extract every ounce of it from people who couldn't fight back. He was the kind of manager who wore polo shirts with the store logo and held them like they were military dress uniforms, who spoke in the tone of someone who believed his authority extended beyond the automatic doors. He was 43, divorced, and had discovered that pharmaceutical supply chains were more lucrative than retail management, which was the problem. Which was why Elena was here. Morning inventory logs, Pierce announced, holding up her meticulous documentation like it was evidence of a crime. The papers were pristine. Color-coded by expiration date. Cross-referenced with lot numbers. Flagged with the discrepancies she'd found, the ones that showed where the orders didn't match patient prescriptions, where the numbers got creative. This is excessive. The assistant managers shifted. They didn't know what they were looking at. Documentation that slows down customer service, Pierce continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man delivering judgment. We're a retail operation, not a pharmacy auditing firm. Rotate stock. Scan items. Move on. Elena, you're overthinking this. She didn't respond. Response required explanation, and explanation required revealing that she'd noticed the 43-unit discrepancy in the oxycodone orders from last month alone. That she'd cross-referenced the wholesale purchase records against the actual patient scripts filled by the pharmacy tech, a 19-year-old named Marcus who was as crooked as a bent paperclip and twice as sharp. That she'd documented everything in a secure encrypted database that currently sat in a Naval Intelligence server farm in Alexandria, Virginia. That Derek Pierce had just called her obsessive for doing the job that was going to end his career. Elena met his eyes with the flat, measured gaze of someone who'd held a colleague's hand while they bled out on a medevac floor, and she simply nodded. Understood, she said. Just that. No apology. No defensiveness. The voice was soft, carefully modulated to sound deferential, service worker meek, but her hands had stopped moving. That was the tell, the micro-expression that revealed the predator beneath the prey animal suit. Hands that had held lives together. Hands that had performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife because the surgical suite was 2 kilometers away and the patient was dying in her arms. But Derek Pierce wasn't the kind of man who noticed tells. By 9 a.m., he'd reassigned her to the parking lot. Cart duty. The kind of work that kept her separated from the pharmacy section, from the records, from the evidence. He called it punishment. She called it an opportunity to monitor who came and went from the loading dock, who moved merchandise into the back office, which federal agents might already be watching the building. Derek Pierce had positioned her perfectly for her investigation, he just thought he was pushing her away. The November air bit at her face as she began stacking carts, organizing them with the same precision she brought to everything, orderly rows, no wasted space, each cart nested perfectly against the next. The carts made a screech of metal on metal as she moved them, a sound like wounded animals calling out. She was halfway through the second row when the laughter started by the vending machines. "Look at her!" Pierce's voice, dripping with the kind of contempt that comes from absolute certainty of superiority. "Military training. You don't just leave that in the barracks, do you? Some people can't function like normal humans." The assistant managers laughed, the nervous, hierarchical laughter of people who knew their paychecks depended on finding Derek Pierce amusing. Elena continued stacking. Her movements didn't pause. Her jaw didn't clench. Not visibly. Not enough for anyone to see. But inside, something cold and ancient rotated on its axis like a lighthouse beam sweeping across dark water. "Perfect little soldier," Pierce continued, and one of the managers, a kid named Bradley with aspirations of becoming a shift supervisor, laughed a little too hard. "Can't even stack grocery carts like a normal person. Probably learned that in basic training. Probably sleeps in her car like it's a barracks. Am I right, Elena? You've got that whole military thing going on. The whole trying too hard vibe." She placed another cart. The metal sang. She didn't look at him. What he didn't know was that she'd been a captain in the United States Navy Medical Corps. That she'd served 3 deployments to Helmand Province with the 2nd Medical Battalion, assigned to combat support hospitals where the casualties came in faster than the surgeons could operate. That she'd performed 147 combat surgeries under fire, including 2 emergency field thoracotomies, once with a combat knife and a plastic for line kit when the surgical team had been pinned down by sniper fire for 4 hours. That the reason her hands moved with such precision was that they'd learned to function when her mind was screaming. What he didn't know was that Nightingale 6, that was her call sign, the one whispered by the soldiers who'd watched her work, had left the Navy not because she was broken, but because Naval Intelligence had found her something better to do. But that wasn't the worst part. The stock clerk found her in the pharmacy section at 11:13 a.m., 3 minutes before her break, when she was returning to scan the incoming shipment of antihistamines. His name was Torres. Former Army medic, 68W Combat Medic Badge, 3 years in the service before his knees went bad and the Army let him go with a pension and a permanent limp. He moved through the store with the careful, deliberate gait of someone who'd learned that rushing was a luxury. He watched her work, really watched her, not the dismissive glance of a coworker, but the focused attention of someone recognizing a language they understood in their bones. The customer came through at 11:49. She was an older woman, maybe 70, with grey hair in a bun and the kind of wedding ring that had been on her finger for 50 years. She'd been reaching for a box of antihistamine on the top shelf when her foot caught the bottom rung of the stepladder. The fall took maybe 2 seconds. Her compound fracture took 30. The bone tore through the skin of her left forearm, a jagged white shard of radius protruding at an angle that shouldn't exist. The scream came a half-second later, the authentic sound of real pain, the kind that doesn't have an off switch. Blood began pooling on the tile, dark and spreading like spilled coffee. Elena moved. She didn't run. Runners drew attention. She walked with the kind of speed that came from urgency without panic, and she was already assessing, no arterial spray, which meant the radial artery was probably intact, but the bleeding wasn't slow either, which meant the fracture was serious, which meant they needed to stabilize and transport in under 4 minutes or they'd lose the limb. She pulled off her vest and created a barrier, hands working as if possessed by muscle memory that predated thought. Sterile field. She had hand sanitizer from her pocket, alcohol-based, 62%, sterile enough for field work. She used a plastic produce bag from her scrub pocket, always carried them, always prepared, and created a clean surface. The tourniquet came next, fashioned from the elastic waistband of a plastic shopping bag and a reflex hammer she'd lifted from the pharmacy supply cabinet 6 weeks ago and kept in her jacket. The tourniquet technique was the Kandahar splice, a specific method of wrapping and applying pressure that minimized tissue damage while maximizing blood flow restriction. She'd learned it from a Pakistani trauma surgeon during a joint operations medical training exercise in 2015. 2 minutes. The bleeding had slowed to ooze. The fracture was still open, but she positioned the limb so the bone was supported, and she'd wrapped clean plastic from the first aid station around the whole assembly, a makeshift dressing that would hold until the ambulance arrived. She was reaching for her phone to call 911 when Torres appeared above her, his face the color of ceiling paint. "That's the Kandahar splice," he whispered. Not asked. Stated. His voice shook slightly. "That's the Kandahar tourniquet splice." "Who taught you that?" Elena kept her hand steady. The older woman was conscious now, pain-locked but breathing, her vital signs as stable as they could be given the trauma. Elena looked up at Torres with the kind of calm that came from having held this exact patient, the exact arterial pressure, the exact bone angle, the exact moment of crisis, 17 times across 3 years in medical operations. She didn't explain. Explanation was a luxury her cover couldn't afford. She simply met his eyes, and in that moment, she let the mask slip just enough for him to see the truth underneath. Not all of it. Never all of it. But enough that Torres understood he was looking at someone who'd treated compound fractures in places where the medevac helicopters were targets, where the operating theaters didn't have air conditioning, where you learned the Kandahar splice because it was the difference between amputation and survival. "Call 911, Elena said quietly. That was all. No apology. No explanation. No revelation. Just a command, delivered with the flat authority of someone who expected obedience and knew they'd get it. Torres pulled out his phone with shaking hands. The paramedics arrived in 4 minutes and 17 seconds. They found a woman in a green SaveMart vest who'd already done 70% of their job, who'd stabilized the fracture with professional precision, who stepped back and said, "She's yours," with the kind of quiet respect that medics give to medics. The older woman was loaded into the ambulance, asking Elena's name, asking if she'd come visit, and Elena said yes because she meant it, and then she turned back to her cart and her work and her cover. But Torres stood in the middle of aisle 7, watching her move back toward the pharmacy section with that military precision, that controlled efficiency, that presence that made the air pressure change, and he knew. Not what. But that something true lived underneath that green vest. The staff meeting broke at 9:08 a.m. Derek Pierce held Elena's inventory logs above his head like a trophy, 20 employees clustered in the break room around the industrial coffee maker, and his voice carried the particular satisfaction of a man about to publicly dismantle someone's competence. "This," he said, tapping the binder, "is what happens when people don't understand retail logistics. Excessive documentation. Military-grade filing systems. Miss Martinez here thinks SaveMart runs like a barracks." Laughter rippled through the cluster, tight, nervous laughter, the kind that only happens when a manager is giving permission. Elena stood near the back, her posture unchanged, her hands folded at her waist. Her jaw tightened imperceptibly. Just a muscle, barely visible. No one would have called it a reaction. Pierce continued, "Some people can't leave basic training behind, and frankly, that creates liability for the rest of us. Effective immediately, you're reassigned to cart duty. Parking lot. We'll find someone else for the pharmacy section." The relief on his face was audible. She nodded once. Returned to her locker. By 11:23 a.m., Elena had moved 47 shopping carts from the front row into the corrugated steel bay beside the loading dock. The November wind cut across the Raleigh asphalt with the particular sting of coming winter, the kind that bit at exposed wrists and numbed fingers after the 3rd hour. She worked methodically, each cart aligned perpendicular to the next, wheels precisely angled at 45-degree intervals, a geometric pattern that would have looked like military formation if anyone bothered to examine it. No one did. Cart duty was invisible work. The kind of work that existed in the margin between customer sight lines and management consideration. Around 2 p.m., Derek Pierce emerged from the automatic doors with 2 assistant managers in tow, Jackson with his perpetually damp shirt collar and Rivera with her phone always half-raised, ready to capture something worth sharing. Pierce had positioned himself near the vending machines, close enough to watch, far enough to maintain plausible deniability. His voice carried across the parking lot with the particular projection of someone who knew his audience was listening. "Some people can't leave basic training behind," he said, loud enough for Elena to hear but directed at Jackson and Rivera. "Notice the angles. Notice the alignment. Corporal Cardboard here thinks every cart requires a 90-degree intersection." Rivera laughed, a sharp, barking sound that died quickly in the wind. Jackson joined in a half-second late, the kind of follower's laugh that always came just behind the leaders. Elena's hands continued moving. Right hand guiding the cart stem. Left hand steadying the frame. Her breathing remained even, controlled, the kind of breathing that came from 8 years of doing difficult things in difficult places. "Maybe we should let her reorganize the entire parking lot," Pierce continued. "Might solve our customer satisfaction scores. Nothing says welcome to SaveMart like military precision and hostile efficiency." The venom in his voice had a particular flavor, the flavor of a man who had noticed her attention to detail was catching problems he'd hoped would stay buried. The inflated pharmaceutical orders. The discrepancies in the controlled substance logs. The subtle mathematical impossibilities that only appeared if you actually paid attention to what the numbers were saying. Elena stacked the final cart and walked past them without acknowledgement, without a word, her movements carrying the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had already survived far worse than Derek Pierce's mockery. The 3 men watched her go. Pierce's smile tightened slightly. He'd been expecting something, a flinch, a defensive comment, some visible crack in the surface. Instead, she'd simply completed the task and moved on, as if his words were background noise, as meaningful as the wind. The real punishment came in the afternoon. Around 3 p.m., Elena entered the pharmacy section to retrieve the controlled substance log for the afternoon recount, standard procedure, something she'd done 47 times in the previous 3 weeks. Derek Pierce stood blocking the storage room entrance, his presence somehow making the air pressure change, making the fluorescent light seem dimmer by proximity. His name tag caught the light. His voice, when he spoke, carried the controlled tone of a man executing a predetermined strategy. "I'm going to need you to submit a request form before accessing that room going forward," he said. "Trust issues. Your documentation habits raise some concerns about how carefully you handle sensitive materials." Elena met his eyes without expression. "The log requires hourly reconciliation. Standard federal regulation." "Submit the request," Pierce repeated. "I'll approve or deny based on operational need." She nodded once. "Walk back to the front counter." Filled out a form requesting access to medication storage, a form that had never existed until this moment, a form that was entirely his invention, a form designed to create delay and establish a paper trail suggesting she was the problem. 12 minutes later, he approved it, but the message was crystalline: "You are now operating under my scrutiny. Every movement logged. Every action documented. Every decision subject to my judgment." But that wasn't the real escalation. That came at 3:44 p.m., when a woman screamed near aisle 7. Elena heard it first, that particular register of pain that meant bone displacement, and moved toward it while other customers scattered backward. An elderly woman lay between the organic vegetable displays and the produce coolers, her left arm bent at an angle that nature had not intended. The fall had been substantial. The compound fracture, visible through torn skin, was obvious even from 6 feet away. A daughter stood frozen nearby, phone in hand, mouth open but no sound coming out. Elena knelt beside the woman without hesitation, her hands moving with the certainty of someone who had done this thousands of times before. "I'm Elena. I'm trained in first aid. Can you tell me your name?" Her voice had changed, dropped an octave, carried authority that the previous hours of silence had not suggested was even possible. The elderly woman gasped her name. Elena's fingers found the fracture point, assessed the damage, understood immediately that standard first aid would be insufficient. A compound fracture of that severity could lose circulation if not stabilized properly. Blood supply to the lower arm was already compromised. She needed a sterile field immediately. "Torres," she called out, recognizing the weekend stock clerk who had been shelving near the back. Torres appeared, moving quickly, and Elena's eyes met his for exactly 1 second, long enough for him to understand this was not a request. First aid kit from the back. Hand sanitizer from your station. And I need plastic bags. Clean ones. Torres moved. He was Army, or had been. The medic's instinct was obvious in how quickly he understood hierarchy in a crisis, understood that someone had just stepped into a role that superseded any corporate structure. He returned with supplies, and Elena's hands moved on their own, creating a sterile field using hand sanitizer as antiseptic barrier, plastic bags as sterile drape, an improvised but effective containment system that would keep the wound from further contamination while preventing shock. She had done this in Kandahar. She had done this in Helmand province in a field hospital that was really just a tent and a prayer. The muscle memory was absolute. The knowledge lived in her hands. Torres watched her work. His face went pale. "That's the Kandahar tourniquet splice," he whispered, not quite a question. "That's a field hospital procedure." "Who taught you that?" Elena's eyes remained on the wound, her movements precise and controlled. "Call 911, she said to the daughter. "Tell them we have a compound fracture, lower left arm, possible circulatory compromise. We need an ambulance." She glanced up at Torres, just for a moment, and her expression communicated everything her words could not say. Her cover allowed no explanations. Her history belonged to a different woman wearing a different uniform in a different country. This version of Elena Martinez worked in a grocery store and had no knowledge of field medicine beyond what a certified first aid card required. The ambulance was 7 minutes out when Derek Pierce arrived. He pushed through the gathering crowd of customers, 20 people now, phones raised, the disaster unfolding in real time and already destined for social media platforms and local news cycles. His face went white the moment he understood what he was watching. Elena had stabilized the fracture with a level of precision that no amateur first aider could have demonstrated. She'd created a compression system that was textbook emergency medicine. She was doing exactly what a trauma nurse would do, exactly what an army medic would do, exactly what someone trained in field medicine under actual combat conditions would do. His voice came out as a hiss. "If you practice medicine without a license on company property again, security will escort you out in handcuffs. Are we clear, Miss Nightingale?" The nickname was meant to wound, meant to reduce her to something dismissible, something small. A little bird. Something confined. Elena met his eyes. No flinch. No defensive response. Just a single nod that communicated absolute understanding. She turned back to the elderly woman, the real patient, the human being who mattered, and kept her hand steady on the fracture site. "Ambulance is close," she said softly. "You're going to be fine." The woman squeezed her hand, a gesture of gratitude that Derek Pierce interpreted as confirmation that Elena had just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. What he didn't understand yet was that the line was much older than this afternoon. The line went back 8 years. The line went back to Helmand province and to a field hospital that had saved 43 lives in a single night under sustained mortar fire. The line existed in the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the 2nd Medical Battalion insignia she'd carried through 3 deployments and would carry forever, because some scars ran too deep to ever fully heal. The ambulance arrived at 3:54 p.m. The paramedics assessed the fracture, acknowledged Elena's improvised stabilization with professional respect, and transported the elderly woman without incident. The crowd dispersed slowly. Customers returned to their shopping. The normal rhythm of SaveMart resumed as if nothing had happened. Elena returned to her cart duty in the parking lot. But everything had changed. Derek Pierce watched from the loading dock, his earlier confidence beginning to curdle into something darker, something closer to fear. She had revealed something he couldn't UNC. She had demonstrated knowledge he couldn't explain away. She had saved someone's life in front of 20 witnesses using techniques that required training no grocery store shelf stocker should have possessed. He had 3 hours to decide how to destroy her before the hospital administrator he'd been bribing transferred to a new facility, and Elena's investigation closed without achieving its objective. The produce section smelled like ozone and copper, the scent of defibrillator discharge mixed with something older, something Elena recognized from 3 tours in Helmand Province, the metallic tang of a body pushed past its oxygen threshold. Commander Marcus Cross lay sprawled between the apple displays and the banana racks, his airway collapsing like a fist closing around his own throat, his face the color of spoiled plums. The eggplant beside his head seemed almost mocking in comparison. Elena was already moving before the first customer finished screaming. She didn't run. Running would have drawn questions she couldn't answer. Instead, her hands moved on their own, muscle memory taking over the way it always did when civilian protocols became obstacles to breathing. The pocket knife came out of her scrub pocket, the same 3.2-inch blade she'd used to open field dressings in Sanjan Valley. The ballpoint pen from her name badge followed. Her fingers found the cricothyroid membrane with the precision of a surgical laser, the small depression between the thyroid and cricoid cartilage that felt the same whether you were in a Raleigh SaveMart or a combat support hospital in Helmand Province. The knife moved. One clean incision. The hiss of air escaping, that sound she'd heard 24 times before, the sound of a drowning man suddenly able to breathe. She inserted the pen barrel through the opening, twisted it sideways for stabilization, and stepped back. 12 seconds. That's all it took to convert a dying man into a living one. The commander's eyes snapped open. His hand grabbed her wrist with the grip of someone who'd just been pulled back from the edge of nothing. His mouth moved. No sound yet, the pen barrel was doing the breathing for him, but his throat was open now, his lungs inflating with air instead of his own failing tissue. His pupils dilated, then narrowed, focusing. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by confusion. Confusion because the woman kneeling over him in a SaveMart vest with a blood-stained pocket knife in one hand wasn't a paramedic. Confusion because she moved like someone who'd done this before. Confusion because nobody who worked produce should know where the cricothyroid membrane was located. The ambulance siren started 3 blocks away. Elena could hear them wailing closer, getting louder, while Cross's eyes tracked her face like he was trying to memorize something important. His breathing was steadier now. The pen barrel held. The O2 sat climbing, 88, 91, 94, she could see the oxygen saturation returning to his face, the purple-gray flush receding toward something resembling human. His lips moved again, forming words his throat couldn't push through yet, but she read them anyway. Who are you? The paramedics burst through the automatic doors with a stretcher and a portable oxygen kit. Elena stepped aside, giving them space, watching them work the scene like they were performing steps in a dance they'd practiced 1,000 times. Intubation attempt. Tube placement. Monitor leads. For line. The choreography of emergency medicine on civilian ground where nobody assumed the stock clerk in the green vest had field-certified experience with emergency surgical airway management. Cross raised one hand as they were loading him toward the ambulance, his eyes locked on Elena. He was trying to say something. Trying to object. Trying to tell them that the woman in the SaveMart uniform had just handed him his life back. But she was already turning away, already removing her vest, pulling the green polyester over her head while his stretcher rolled past, because Derek Pierce had emerged from his office like something predatory finally sensing blood in the water. Pierce's face had gone the color of wet concrete. His eyes weren't focused on the paramedics or the customer crowd gathering at the store entrance. They were fixed on Elena, then on Cross, then back to Elena again, calculating, reassessing, understanding that something had just shifted in the calculus of his afternoon. The ambulance doors closed. Elena watched them seal shut for exactly 2 seconds before Pierce grabbed her arm with fingers that felt like iron clamps. Back office. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a command issued in a voice that had learned to issue commands in other lives, other contexts, before Derek Pierce had become just a manager at a SaveMart in Raleigh, North Carolina. She followed him because refusing would draw attention, because the paramedics were still visible through the storefront glass, because drawing a scene would compromise what remained of her cover even though her cover was already compromised. The back office smelled like stale coffee and the paperwork of 1,000 small deceptions. Pierce slammed the door. His hands were shaking, actually trembling, as he jabbed one finger in her direction like a weapon. "You just created massive criminal liability for this company," he said, and the words came out in a rush, a flood, evidence of a man whose composure was fragmenting in real time. "Medical procedures without a license. Unauthorized intervention. That's malpractice. That's assault. That's..." He stopped, turned to his desk, grabbed his phone with both hands because one hand wasn't steady enough to hold it alone. Elena watched him while her mind was working through the implications he was just discovering. The hospital administrator she'd been sent to investigate. The one who'd been signing off on Pierce's inflated pharmaceutical orders. The one who'd been receiving kickbacks for approving Medicaid claims that should have been flagged as fraud. That administrator had transferred this morning, new facility, 3 states away, taking his institutional knowledge and his compromised protocols with him. Elena's mission had just become impossible in real time. The investigation would close. The fraud would continue at whatever new hospital system hired him. And Elena would be pulled from the field, her cover blown, her placement terminated, everything she'd built in Raleigh reduced to ashes and paperwork. Pierce was already making calls. She could hear him on the phone with his voice pitched low and urgent, talking to someone at Mercy General Pharmacy downtown. "Lawsuit waiting to happen," he was saying. "Medical procedure without credentials. Liability nightmare. I wouldn't touch her if she applies." Click. Next call. Same script. Different number. Then another. And another. She could track his progress through the county's medical network like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. By the time he finished his third call, Elena understood with absolute clarity that Derek Pierce was systematically destroying every professional avenue available to her in Raleigh. He was burning her network. He was ensuring that her cover employment couldn't be salvaged through normal channels. He was creating a firewall of liability and warning that would seal her out of every clinic, every pharmacy, every medical facility where Naval Intelligence might have placed her next. The office window looked out onto the sales floor. Torres was there, moving between aisles with the careful precision of someone trying to be invisible. The stock clerk, the former army medic who'd recognized the Kandahar technique in aisle 7, was pretending to straighten the serial displays while his eyes tracked Pierce's movements. Torres had seen Elena perform the emergency field procedure. Torres knew. And Torres was smart enough to keep his mouth closed about it. Pierce's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his face went another shade paler. His hand actually shook as he opened his messages. His jaw clenched. Whatever he was reading, it was worse than what he'd just experienced in the produce section. Elena could read the realization moving across his face like a storm front. The commander had enough presence of mind to provide information. Identification. A name that could be verified. A rank that could be confirmed. A reason to ask questions about who exactly had performed an authorized medical intervention in aisle 3. The door to the back office opened without a knock. Torres stood in the frame, his expression carefully neutral, his voice carefully level. The commander left his wallet. Fell out during transport. "Should I?" "Give it here," Pierce said, and his hand shot out like he was catching something dangerous before it could detonate. Torres handed over the black leather bifold and stepped back. Pierce flipped it open. Elena watched his face while he processed what he was seeing, the military ID with the SEAL Trident insignia. The rank. The unit designation. The understanding that the man she'd just saved was no random customer who'd choked on a grape. The understanding that Commander Marcus Cross was Navy. Was trained. Was important. Was exactly the kind of person who had friends, resources, and the institutional weight to ask very specific questions about the SaveMart employee who'd saved his life. "Get back to work," Pierce snapped at Torres, and the stock clerk disappeared back into the sales floor without protest. Then Pierce turned to Elena. His voice had dropped 3 octaves. It was quiet now, which was somehow worse than the shouting. Quiet voices made decisions. Quiet voices executed them. "You're fired. Effective immediately. Collect your personal items and leave the premises. You are not to enter this building again. Any further contact with SaveMart employees or customers will result in legal action for harassment and trespassing. Elena didn't respond. Didn't argue. Didn't defend. She simply stood, her face showing nothing, no surprise, no anger, no reaction beyond the stoic composure that had carried her through 3 deployments and 2 Purple Hearts. She walked past Pierce to the employee lockers in the corner of the office. Her locker opened without resistance. Inside was the cracked ceramic mug from the break room, the one that said "World's Okayest Employee" in fading blue letters. The half-dead succulent someone had gifted her on her first week, now mostly brown leaves and stubbornness. The photograph of the Marine platoon she'd lost in a Helmand Province ambush 5 years ago, their faces young and certain and permanent in the way only the dead truly were. She stuffed them into a cardboard box. The unit patch, the 2nd Medical Battalion insignia she'd sewn into the jacket lining 3 months ago, the anchor that connected her to her actual life, her actual rank, her actual purpose, stayed where it was. Hidden. Because pulling it out now would acknowledge what was happening. Acknowledging what was happening might crack the composure that was keeping her upright. Pierce followed her to the sales floor, already announcing her termination to the evening shift gathering for their scheduled briefing. His voice was steady again, almost performative in its normalcy. Elena Martinez is no longer employed by SaveMart effective immediately. Please collect her vest and badge. The assistant managers exchanged glances. A few employees shifted their weight, uncomfortable with the public spectacle of termination. Someone murmured something about being sudden. Nobody asked why. Elena removed the green vest. Handed over the badge with the embossed SaveMart logo and her photo, the careful image of someone who'd been hired to stock shelves and take inventory. The fabric released from her shoulders like a skin she was shedding. Underneath was the truth, the scar tissue on her left arm from shrapnel, visible now in the harsh fluorescent lights. The calluses on her hands from holding surgical instruments and climbing ropes and surviving. The weight of 3 months undercover, 3 months building a cover identity that was now burning to ash. She turned toward the exit. The cardboard box felt impossibly light in her hands, her entire civilian identity fitting in something that could have held cereal or canned beans. The automatic doors opened. Cold November air hit her face. The parking lot extended before her, empty except for cars and the distant sound of traffic on Capitol Boulevard. She didn't look back. Didn't acknowledge the employees watching from inside. Didn't register Pierce standing at the store entrance with the expression of someone who'd just made a decision that felt necessary and righteous, not yet understanding that he'd just made the single worst decision of his professional life. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was standing at the bus stop 20 minutes later, rain beginning to fall like judgment, while her phone buzzed with a message from her handler. Subject transferred. Investigation closed. Return to base. Your next assignment begins in 6 weeks. The 2nd Medical Battalion insignia sewn into her jacket lining felt heavier than armor, and Elena traced it with one finger while the rain mixed with something she refused to call tears, because crying was a luxury, and Captain Elena Martinez had given up luxuries a long time ago. The bus stop bench was wet, rain pooling beneath the slats, and Elena sat anyway. The cardboard box balanced on her lap weighed almost nothing, that was the strange part. 3 months of employment reduced to objects light enough for a child to carry. The cracked mug from the break room read "World's Okayest Employee" in faded Comic Sans, a gift from someone whose name she'd already forgotten. Beside it, a half-dead succulent she'd kept alive through fluorescent lights and neglect, its leaves curled like arthritic fingers. Beneath both, wrapped in a SaveMart receipt, a photograph, 17 Marines standing in the Afghan sun, arms slung across shoulders, grinning at a camera like they had forever ahead of them. 5 years later, 6 of those faces were still breathing. 11 were not. Elena's fingers found the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the 2nd Medical Battalion insignia, threadbare and barely visible, but still there. She'd carried it through Kandahar. Through Marja. Through the valley in Sanjin where a Taliban sniper's round caught her in the shoulder and she'd kept working anyway, because stopping meant someone died. The patch felt heavier now than it ever had in combat. Rain dripped off her chin. She didn't wipe it. Couldn't tell where the rain ended and the other thing began, and she'd learned long ago not to acknowledge the difference. A car splashed through the street-side puddle. Dirty water soaked her shoes, the kind of casual cruelty the city inflicted on people waiting for buses they couldn't afford not to take. Elena stared at the soggy cardboard. 3 hours. That's how long it took to go from undercover intelligence operative to terminated employee with a box of personal effects. 3 hours between saving Commander Cross's life and Derek Pierce's voice, cold as surgical steel, informing the evening shift that she'd been fired for practicing medicine without a license on company property and creating unacceptable liability. What he actually meant was that her emergency tracheotomy had forced him to choose between acknowledging her competence or protecting his fraudulent pharmaceutical orders. He'd chosen the orders. The real problem was that the hospital administrator she'd been investigating, the one routing inflated supply chain costs through SaveMart's pharmacy, had transferred to a facility in Chapel Hill 3 days ago. Her cover was already compromised. The mission was already lost. Saving Commander Cross hadn't cost her the investigation had already cost itself. But Pierce didn't know that. Pierce just knew that a grocery store clerk had revealed herself as something far more dangerous than her job title suggested, and predators like Pierce understood only one response to that kind of threat: elimination. She closed her eyes. The rain hammered the shelter's metal roof like distant artillery. Back in Helmand, incoming round sounded like this: percussion and more percussion, the sound of everything trying to kill you from different angles simultaneously. She'd learned to sleep through it. To work through it. To distinguish between rain and blood by sound alone, because in the field hospital, the distinction meant triage decisions, and triage decisions meant someone went home and someone didn't. Elena had become very good at making those decisions. She'd become very bad at living in a world where people just waited for buses in the rain. The succulent would die within a week. She knew this with the same certainty she'd known the compound fracture victim in IL-7 needed immediate immobilization and the commander needed an airway opened in approximately 90 seconds or his brain would start dying. She'd saved the succulent for 3 months through a combination of minimal attention and low expectations. It was a metaphor she was too tired to unpack. The mug was already broken, a hairline fracture down the right side that made it impossible to drink from without spilling. Perfect, then. A trophy for a job that no longer existed. At St. Michael's Hospital, Commander Cross made calls from his recovery bed, his throat bandaged but his voice clear enough, a little hoarse, but functional. He'd learned to speak again within 6 hours of surgery, which meant Elena's emergency cricothyrotomy through the cricothyroid membrane had been textbook perfect. Of course it had been. She'd performed the procedure 17 times in combat conditions, 11 times in a field hospital with dust storms reducing visibility to 10 meters. A grocery store produce section with fluorescent lighting and a civilian audience barely registered as a difficulty. Commander Cross spoke to his chain of command. He spoke to Naval Intelligence. He spoke to investigators whose names he didn't mention but whose clearance levels he could hear in the silence that followed his sentences. The woman who saved my life wasn't just a grocery store clerk, he told them. Find out who she really is. Derek Pierce, meanwhile, celebrated with Jackson and Rivera at the Cardinal, the bar across the street from SaveMart. Elena could see it from the bus stop, warm light spilling onto rain-slick pavement, the kind of place that served bottom-shelf whiskey to middle management types who believed the world confirmed their importance every time someone junior failed. Pierce would be telling them about getting rid of dead weight before she cost them everything. He'd frame it as business acumen. Liability management. Tough decisions in a competitive marketplace. He wouldn't frame it as the systematic destruction of a Navy officer's cover, the sabotage of a 3-month investigation, the calculated removal of a witness to his own crimes. But those framings were the same thing, just in different languages. What Derek Pierce didn't know, what he couldn't have known, because the machinery of federal oversight moved on timelines that predators like him never understood, was that the formal complaint he'd filed against Elena for unlicensed medical practice had automatically triggered a pharmacy board investigation. Automatic. The kind of invisible consequence that bureaucracy inflicted on people who thought they were clever enough to exploit bureaucracy. Every pharmaceutical transaction SaveMart had processed in the previous 6 months was now flagged for audit. Every Medicaid order, every insurance claim, every supply chain invoice. Auditors were already arriving. Federal agents were already reviewing documentation. The fraud investigation Pierce thought he'd eliminated by firing Elena had actually metastasized into something far larger than a single undercover operative. But he wouldn't understand that until the doors burst open and the arrest warrant was read. Elena watched rain collect on the cardboard box. The mug would rust. The succulent would die. The photograph would become unreadable. She'd be gone by then, reassigned or deactivated or buried in some new operation that required her to be someone else entirely. That was the job. That was always the job: become someone, convince everyone you're that person, then step out of the skin and walk away from the life you'd built like it was a costume that never fit right in the first place. She'd done it 7 times since leaving active duty. 7 different cover identities, 7 different careers, 7 different versions of herself that other people had believed in with the kind of conviction usually reserved for faith. And every time, the moment of extraction came like an amputation, clean and necessary, and accompanied by the phantom pain of a limb that was no longer there. She wondered if she'd ended her career over a stranger's life. If Captain Elena Martinez, who had held a field hospital together for 11 hours while Taliban forces closed from 3 directions, had just destroyed 18 months of careful intelligence work by choosing to save one Navy SEAL commander instead of maintaining her cover. The calculus of that decision was brutal and mathematical. 1 life against 11 potential prosecutions of pharmaceutical fraud. 1 person's breath against the systematic theft that had probably cost the taxpayers enough money to fund field hospitals for actual combat zones. She'd made the right call. The tactical calculus was clean. But tactical calculus didn't keep you warm at a bus stop in November. It didn't explain why the box on your lap felt like it weighed 10,000 pounds. It didn't answer the question of whether you were a soldier or just someone wearing a soldier's memories like other people walk alone, a scent that dissipated in the rain, leaving nothing behind but the person beneath, and Elena had stopped being sure who that person was a very long time ago. The rain mixed with something she refused to call tears. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. Her face was a mask so perfect that the other people waiting for the bus couldn't read a single thing on it, couldn't see the moment when Captain Elena Martinez, decorated officer of the United States Navy, became Elena Martinez, unemployed grocery store clerk with a cardboard box and wet shoes. The transition happened in the space between heartbeats, invisible to everyone but her. She was very good at invisibility. She had trained for it. She had sacrificed for it. She had become it so completely that the moment she tried to step back into herself, she couldn't quite remember where the armor ended and the person began. The commander had made calls of his own, because 150 soldiers in dress uniforms assembled in SaveMart's parking lot at dawn, forming ranks as a Black Hawk landed near the loading dock with rotors that shook the windows like artillery fire. They came from Camp Lejeune, from Naval Station Norfolk, from the 75th Ranger Regiment stationed at Fort Liberty, all of them moving with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators stepping into formation. The parking lot asphalt glistened from overnight rain, and their boots hit the wet concrete in perfect synchronization. 1, 2, 3, 4, a percussion that echoed off the storefront glass and made every SaveMart customer inside stop and stare. The sun was barely clearing the tree line when a Marine colonel strode through the automatic doors carrying a manila file folder, his dress blue so crisp they looked pressed with a blade. He found Elena shelving returns in aisle 12, her green employee vest hanging loose over her shoulders like a cover she'd forgotten to take off, and he said quietly, "Captain Martinez, your call sign was Nightingale 6. Elena's hands went still on the box of bandages. Not because she was shocked. Because the moment had finally arrived, and some part of her had been holding her breath for 90 days waiting for this sentence. The colonel opened the file folder. Navy Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Valor. He waited. Bronze Star. Another pause. Purple Heart. He flipped the page. And a Navy Cross awarded for actions in Helmand Province, 2019. Citation reads, held a field hospital alone for 11 hours under sustained fire, performed 17 emergency procedures with no backup, 0 casualty rate among 18 wounded. The words landed in the fluorescent-lit silence like ordnance. 0 casualty rate, Captain. Your patients live because you refuse to let them die. Elena's jaw moved once. That was all. But her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the file, the first break in her stoic composure since the day she'd walked into SaveMart wearing the mask of a woman with nothing special to offer. The colonel saw it. Soldiers always recognize other soldiers by the way they hold themselves together when everything inside is fracturing. A 2-star general in navy dress white stepped forward from the gathered crowd, his presence making the air pressure change like a storm rolling in across the Atlantic. Derek Pierce had been watching from near the pharmacy section, his pharmacy section, the one he'd stolen from the government and his own company with fraudulent orders and Medicaid bribes, and he began to stammer something about impersonating military personnel and company liability. The general cut him off with 3 words that ended everything. Captain Martinez was assigned here by Naval Intelligence to investigate medical fraud. The words were precise as surgical strikes. And you just confessed to witness tampering and obstruction of a federal investigation. He nodded to 2 agents in FBI windbreakers standing near the frozen food section. They didn't run. They didn't hurry. They simply began walking toward Derek Pierce with the kind of calm that comes from having already won. Jackson and Rivera, the assistant managers who'd laughed at the vending machines, suddenly understood that every moment they'd stood beside Pierce while he mocked Elena was going to be extracted from them piece by piece in federal interrogation rooms. Torres, the former Army medic, stepped forward and saluted Elena, a clean right-hand motion that seemed to echo through the entire store. "I knew something was different about you," he said quietly. "The way you moved in that aisle. That wasn't civilian training. I knew, but I didn't know." Behind him, 150 soldiers stood at absolute attention, their uniforms immaculate, they're bearing the kind of discipline that can only come from surviving things civilians couldn't imagine. The commander, still hoarse but standing now, approached Elena as the federal agents placed handcuffs on Derek Pierce near the bakery section. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd watched her move her hands through his chest cavity in a grocery store and understood that death had come for him and she had told it no. "This woman saved my life twice," he said, and his words reached every corner of the store. "Once in a grocery store yesterday. Once 5 years ago in Afghanistan when my SEAL team was ambushed near a Marine position and she kept 4 of my men alive until medevac arrived under fire." He paused. She did it with a knife in her hands and the kind of training that only comes from someone who understands that the person in front of you is somebody's child. The colonel held up Elena's dress uniform, the one she hadn't worn in public in 3 months, the one she'd carried in a garment bag to SaveMart on her first day of undercover assignment. Her ribbons were still there. The Navy Cross sat above the Bronze Star sat above the Purple Heart, 3 medals that told a story of violence and survival and the refusal to let people die on your watch. She took the uniform from his hands, and for the first time since this had all begun, since the first day Pierce had mocked her in front of the morning staff meeting, since the moment she'd realized her cover was blown, since the moment she'd held a blade to a man's throat to save his life, her composure fractured. Not her voice. Not her bearing. But her hands trembled as she held the uniform, and everyone in SaveMart saw it. Derek Pierce, watching from the back of the federal car as agents placed him inside with the precision of handlers securing a dangerous animal, saw 150 soldiers stand at attention as Elena changed her stance. The timid stock clerk became something else entirely. Her shoulders squared. Her chin lifted. Her entire frame seemed to shed the disguise like a snake shedding skin. She became Captain Elena Martinez, USN, and the woman Derek Pierce had spent 3 months trying to destroy was finally standing in her own light. 30 seconds. That's all it took to change everything. The pharmacy audit that Pierce's own complaint against Elena had triggered automatically flagged his 340 fraudulent Medicaid claims over 18 months. Opioid orders inflated to a pill mill operation he ran with the hospital administrator who transferred the moment things got complicated. The federal investigation didn't need Elena to testify. The numbers testified. The documents testified. His own employees testified. Jackson admitted the inventory falsifications. Rivera gave statements about the orders to inflate reports. Torres, the Army medic who'd recognized the truth beneath Elena's disguise, told investigators that Pierce had explicitly threatened termination if anyone questioned the pharmaceutical orders. Everything Pierce had done to burn Elena's professional reputation had been recorded by federal protection details watching her as an undercover operative. Witness intimidation. Obstruction of justice. Conspiracy to commit fraud. But that wasn't the worst part for Derek Pierce. The worst part was that 150 soldiers refused to let her disappear into the rain. 6 weeks later, Derek Pierce drove a medical supply van for the North Carolina prison system under court-ordered restitution, delivering bandages and aspirin and gauze to county jails while serving weekend detention for his fraud convictions. The van was white and anonymous, and he drove it through towns he no longer owned any piece of, distributing supplies to institutions where people had lost everything. It was a specific kind of penance, and he understood the irony. He delivered medical supplies to people who couldn't afford them while Elena, the woman he'd tried to destroy, was being commissioned as the founder of something that would change how the Navy trained its most valuable operatives. Elena stood in full dress uniform at the commissioning ceremony for the new Naval Intelligence training facility in Raleigh, her ribbons displayed in the order of their valor, her uniform pressed with surgical precision. Commander Cross stood beside her as a guest speaker, his voice still carrying the rasp of a man who'd nearly lost his ability to speak. "Captain Martinez taught me that heroes don't always wear uniforms on the outside," he said to the assembled personnel. "Sometimes they wear green employee vests. Sometimes they save lives in produce sections while the world walks past and calls them just a nurse. The most dangerous operators are the ones nobody sees coming." The facility would use Elena's case study as its primary curriculum: how to maintain cover under psychological stress, how to recognize when your identity has been compromised, how to maintain medical competence while pretending to have none. Torres had graduated from nursing school on Navy sponsorship and joined the reserves, recommended personally by Elena herself. Jackson and Rivera had been terminated and cooperated with federal prosecutors, their statements helping establish that Pierce's operation ran deeper than SaveMart. It extended to 3 other retailers, 2 clinics, and a hospital administrator now under federal indictment. The SaveMart where Elena worked installed a plaque near aisle 7. On this site, Captain Elena Martinez, USN, demonstrated that service never ends. At the commissioning reception, a young Naval Intelligence recruit asked Elena how she'd maintained composure during 3 months of humiliation. She touched the faded unit patch sewn inside her dress uniform jacket, the 2nd Medical Battalion insignia she'd carried through 3 deployments, through Helmand Province, through the ambush that had taken her platoon. "Power is not a title," Elena said quietly. "Power is the ability to help." Commander Cross raised a glass. "To the woman who taught a Navy SEAL that the people you should fear most are the ones nobody sees coming." Outside, 150 soldiers who'd assembled in a SaveMart parking lot at dawn remained in formation, rendering final salutes as Elena walked past. No longer invisible. No longer undercover. Finally recognized for the hero she'd always been. If you made it to the end of this story, you already know the truth about the people around you, that quiet strength is real, that hidden service is everywhere, and that the ones who sacrifice the most often ask for the least recognition. Subscribe for more stories about the heroes walking among us. Like this video. And comment below if you recognized someone like Captain Martinez in your life, someone carrying weight you never noticed. Tell us in the comments. They deserve to be seen too.